In 1885 or so, there was a guy by the name of George Waltzer. George Waltzer was an atheist, and he thought that atheism was the greatest idea that anybody had ever come up with. And he decided he was going to start a town on the premise that there is no God, there is no heaven, no hell, no devil, nothing of a spiritual nature whatsoever. And here was his idea. If you could just get people together that only focus on this world, that don't think about the future, don't think about eternity, they just think about putting their energy in this world, then you would have the greatest society that you could possibly have. And that was his stated goal, was to show the world that if you take people who don't believe in God and put them together and let them form a society, it's going to be the greatest society that has ever been. And so he started the town of Liberal, Missouri. I don't know if you are familiar with Liberal, Missouri. It is not that far from here. Liberal, Missouri is a very interesting place. As you can still go to Liberal, Missouri, I took these pictures myself of these population signs, and then, of course, of some of these street signs. There's Walser Avenue, named after George Walser, the man who founded Liberal, Missouri. There's Darwin Drive, named after Charles Darwin, of course, as one of the unbelievers that Walser felt like would have fit in his town. There is Ingersoll Lane for Robert Ingersoll, a very famous agnostic person who didn't believe in God. And so here is the liberal town square, basically. Now, there was a problem with Liberal, Missouri. A man by the name of Clark Braden, who, as I understand it, was a member of the Lord's Church and was a traveling preacher and debater, he went to Liberal and wanted to find out just how well the society based on atheism was going. And so he did some research and stayed there a little while. And he wrote an article in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch in 1885. And that's an actual picture from the 1885 article. We called I think it's the county seat, and got the particular records, and that's it. And he titles it, of course, An Infidel Experiment, the Colony of Liberal in this State, a Practical Experiment in Infidelity. And that's what Waltzer said. This is a practical experiment. We're going to take the belief that there's no God, we're going to put it into practice, and it's going to be great. Well, Braden had a little bit different idea of great than Waltzer did. In fact, Braden wrote about this and said, let me tell you what's going on there. He said, number one, everybody gets drunk all the time. He said the women get drunk just as much as the men. He said everybody curses. They all cuss. The children cuss the parents. There's no obedience or reverence for a mother and a father. He said the place is terrible. The hotels have turned into brothels, and the people who are there wish they could get out, but their property value has sunk so low they can't sell their property because they would lose so much money, and so they're stuck. He said the place is a cesspool of immorality. And he put that in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Well, one of the hotel owners, who Clark Braden had said the hotels have turned into brothels, sued him for $25,000. And in 1885, $25,000 was a considerable amount of money. You're talking about would be the equivalent of millions today. The case went to the judge. The judge, because the evidence was so clear that Clark Braden was telling the truth, threw the case out of court, and the man who sued Clark Braden had to pay all of the court costs. Now, when I went to visit, the Liberal, Missouri cemetery was fascinatingly laid out. And it was laid out in a circle, and it was about this big. There weren't that many, it was about as big as this auditorium. And in the dead center of it was an open spot that originally was reserved for George Walser. He was going to be buried right in the middle of all of the unbelievers because, hey, he didn't believe in an afterlife, anything like that. But it was empty. There was nobody buried there. Because Walser realized, I have made a tragic mistake. I thought that unbelief would be the best possible foundation to build a society. I was absolutely wrong. Couldn't have been more wrong, and I need something else. He came in contact with the teachings of Jesus Christ, and as I understand it, said, I don't want to be buried in Liberal, Missouri. This is his gravestone in Lamar, Missouri, about 45 minutes outside of Liberal. And he became a believer not only in God, but also in Jesus Christ, and said, I have messed up, and what I thought would be the case, and I put it into practice, proved the exact opposite, and I need to change. Now, what I'd like to suggest to us is that beliefs have consequences. And the implications of beliefs, that if you put them into practice, well, they make a very big difference in how you behave. And so, as we look at this, you go to Psalm 14, 1 through 3, and here's what the text says. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. Now, that's a very famous verse. Most of us know it. But most of us stop right there. And we don't listen to what the rest of that text says. And here's what the rest of the text says. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They have done abominable things. There is none who does good, no, not one. Now here's what the text is saying there. That if a person starts with the false idea that there's no God and puts that into practice, then they are going to do things that are immoral and that are dangerous and that are harmful to society if they put that belief into practice. Now let me stop right there and let's ask this question. Is it true that there are people who hold beliefs that they don't put into practice? Oh, yeah. I mean, are there people that if you ask them straight to their face, look them right in the eye and say, are you a Christian? And they say, yeah, oh, absolutely, positively. And you say, do you believe the teachings of Jesus Christ? Yes. But then if you watch them on a Friday night or a Saturday night, are they putting the teachings of Jesus Christ into practice? No. And what we're not saying here, we're not saying that if a person says he or she is an atheist, then that means that person's going to be immoral all the way down the line. And if a person says he or she is a Christian, then that person's going to be acting like Jesus Christ all the way down the line. Have there been people who in the name of Jesus Christ have done horrible, terrible things, and it wasn't really in the name of Jesus Christ? Did the Crusaders kill Muslims in the 11th century and the 12th century in the name of Jesus, in spite of Jesus' statement that if my kingdom were of this world, my people would fight, but my kingdom's not of this world, therefore my people don't fight? Did they do that? Yeah. Did the Salem witch trials have people who claimed to be working for Jesus but were in no way doing what Jesus Christ was asking them to do? Yes. So we're not saying that if a person says he's an atheist, then he's going to behave like this. Or if a person says she's a Christian, she's going to behave like this. Here's what we are saying. That if you are a Christian and you are following the teachings of Jesus Christ, putting them into your life, you will behave this way. And if you are an unbeliever and you are actually living out the implications of unbelief, you would behave this way. And we'll see how that plays out as we continue to look at these things. The first thing I'd like to just lay out for you is this statement. If a group of people behaves like Jesus Christ taught them to behave, do you believe the society where that group of people is will be a better place? Okay. Now, I say that because this is not really even up for discussion. This is a statement from a guy. Now, I'm going to read it to you, Bertrand Russell. Read down at the bottom, just real quick, ideas that have helped mankind. Now, he also has an essay that says, Why I'm Not a Christian. Bertrand Russell was not the friend of Christianity. He was a very well-known agnostic and skeptic and somebody who didn't believe that the Bible's the inspired Word of God. He's not the friend of Christianity. But in his honest assessment of ideas that have helped mankind, he's forced to say these kinds of things. Let me go back here. And he's forced to say this. Christianity, as soon as it conquered the state, he's talking about the Roman culture, it put an end to the gladiatorial shows, not because they were cruel, but they were idolatrous. The result was to diminish the widespread education and cruelty in the populace of Roman towns. He said Christianity also did much to soften the lot of slaves. It established charity on a large scale, inaugurated hospitals. Although the great majority of Christians failed lamentably in Christian charity, the ideal remained alive. And in every age, inspired some notable saints. It passed over modern liberalism. And now listen, this guy's not a Christian at all. Listen to a statement though. And it remains the inspiration behind much that is most hopeful in our somber world. Okay, just think if people really behaved like Jesus taught them to behave. Do unto others as you would have them do to you. Do you believe people in Batesville, Arkansas would wish that their co-workers would do to them like they want done to them? Oh, absolutely, positively. What about let this mind be in you which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God did not consider something to be held on to be equal with God. And then he explains the mind of Christ. Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem others better than himself. Let each of you look out not only for his own interest, but also for the interest of others. Wouldn't it be great if every single person in this congregation decided, I'm going to care more about what my brother and sister needs and wants than I care about what I need and want? To the point that even if it cost me, well, the example of Jesus Christ and Paul saying in Romans, if one died for all, then all died. You know what he was saying? If Jesus Christ was willing to lay down his life for the church, then every single one of the people who are following Jesus Christ should be willing to sacrifice their own needs and wants and desires to the point of them dying, if that would help the growth of the church and help people understand the love of God. Would you want a society that was so self-sacrificial that the first question anybody asked when they woke up in the morning was, what can I do for you? What if a congregation of people said, we're going to behave just like Jesus Christ asked us to? Well, I guess I'm going to say that I've been here for a weekend and I feel like you've got a congregation of people that are really trying to do that. I've been so impressed with the time, energy, effort that's been put in to what we've been doing here this weekend. The Spirit of our Lord that is working in this congregation. I think it's been so exciting to me, and I think that's what you've got going on. And I think the more that you have that, the better the society is. You understand where I'm going with that. Okay. You act like Jesus, place is going to be better. Everything's going to be better. But what if you don't? What if you put the idea of atheism into practice? Now, here's the first problem that you've got. According to evolutionary atheistic teaching, you and I are blind products of chance that have arisen because of naturalistic processes that don't have anything to do with morality at all. Originally, there was a single-celled amoeba, and that amoeba, because of naturalistic processes, evolved into a worm, and then a fish, and then an amphibian, etc. And we are just the next on the chain. And so if there is no soul, if there is no eternal destiny, if you are just a product of natural processes, well, there's no way that anybody can say something is morally right and morally wrong according to atheism. All they can say is it just is. No, you don't have to take my word for that. This is a guy speaking on the campus of University of Tennessee in Knoxville. This guy was from one of the Ivy League schools, as I recall, and he was speaking about Darwin and what evolution teaches ultimately. And here's what he said. He said, naturalistic evolution has clear consequences that Charles Darwin understood perfectly. Number one, no God's worth having exists. Number two, no life after death. Number three, no ultimate foundation for ethics. Number four, no ultimate meaning in life. And number five, no human free will was possible. But we're just going to focus on that number three. He said, if evolution is true, then you can't say anything is morally right or morally wrong. All you can say is you don't like it. All you can say is we'd rather not have it in this society. But if you're to ask the question, is it wrong? He said, well, according to evolution, you just can't make that statement. Notice what Charles Darwin said. He understood that. He said, a man who has no assured and ever-present belief in the existence of a personal God or of future existence with retribution and reward can have for his rule of life, as far as I can see, only to follow those impulses and instincts which are the strongest or which seem to him to be the best ones. He said, okay, if you are just a product of naturalistic laws and you don't think there's a God, you don't think there's a heaven, you don't think there's a hell, how then do you decide if a behavior is right or wrong? And according to Charles Darwin, what does he say? Well, whichever instinct seems the strongest to you. Okay, I was living in Montgomery, right outside of Montgomery. There was a couple of guys who saw a man in a new Ford truck. His wife had asked him to stop in Walmart, pick up some bread and milk. He did. It took him about, 20 minutes, walked in there, came back out. They met him at his truck, shot him dead, stole his truck. Did they do something wrong? I think we all recognize and understand that they absolutely positively did, but according to Charles Darwin, if that is the strongest impulse they have, if they felt like I want this truck and that's overpowering any other impulse that I have, then Darwin says, well, you can lock them up if you don't want that to happen to you. You can try to arrange a society where that is not going to take place regularly. But if you want to say it's morally wrong, you can't do that. Because they're just products of random naturalistic processes over millions of years. And there's no way you can get an absolute morality for that. Continue with me. Dan Barker, I debated this guy in 2009. He is the co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. It's one of the largest foundations, organizations in the United States. It's in Madison, Wisconsin. I think they got 18,000 unbelievers that are registered as members. One of the larger unbelieving groups. And he has been the president now for several decades, I think. He says, in a debate with Peter Payne, he said, there are no actions in and of themselves that are always absolutely right or wrong. It depends on the context. You can't name an action that's always absolutely right or wrong. I can think of an exception in every case. Now, what's interesting is a student came up and said, okay, well, could you ever think of a time when it would be all right to rape somebody? He said, yeah, that's so odd that it would be very, very rare. But, like hypothetically, if some aliens came down and said, we're going to kill all of humankind, if you don't do that, then yes, it would be your moral obligation to do that. Now, I knew he had said that. And so in my debate in 2009, 4 years later, I said, Dan, you said this in 2005. Do you still believe that? He said, yeah. I said, what about two people? He said, yeah. I said, what about 2,000? He said, yeah. Now, before I asked him this next question, I thought, naively at the time, if I can just get him to say this, then atheists and unbelievers who are connected to his group and who have been following his teaching and claiming that he is a spokesman for them will want to distance themselves from him because people know this can't be right. And I said, Dan, what about 2 million people? And he said, yeah, it'd be my moral obligation to save humanity to do that to 2 million people. You see what the problem is? What he's struggling with is if atheism is true, you have to then say, hey, whatever helps the most people, or whatever would help me pass on my genetic information, or you just don't have a moral, absolute foundation that you can say this is right and this is wrong. Now, from a Christian standpoint, from a creation standpoint, you absolutely do have a moral foundation upon which you base this is right and this is wrong, and that is the nature of God. God's nature is such that there are some things that are always absolutely morally right and there are always absolutely morally wrong, and when you move away from acting in accordance with the nature of God, you have violated absolute morality. But if there's no God, if there's nothing above humans, then ultimately morality just ends up being, well, whatever I want to do. And whatever I decide is the best thing to do today. And whatever I decide is going to help me the most, or going to help my family the most, or going to help my genetics get passed on the most. And so you look to ideas like this: abortion and the concept of atheism. Right now, there is a massively tragic acceptance of something that is as morally wrong as any action ever has been in the history of the world. And that is the idea that somehow it would be okay to kill an unborn child. In 1973, with the Roe v. Wade decision, our country, just ours alone, started legally killing. Right now, at the time, it was about 1.3 million a year, but it's now about 900,000, but on average about 1 million babies every single year. If you were to look at the ways that those babies are killed, sometimes in very gruesome ways, sometimes very late in the gestation period, although the time of the gestation period shouldn't matter at all. Where do you get the idea that it would ever be right to kill an unborn child? You know, 9/11 happened, and George W. Bush came on television, and he said, we're not going to put up with this. He said, we are going to hunt down any terrorist who was involved in this. We are going to start a war on terror that cost billions and billions of dollars. And every person basically in the United States of America was absolutely behind him. On that day, terrorists killed about 2,400 United States citizens. Tragically and brutally. On that day in the United States, we killed 2,400 of our own citizens. Called it abortion, said it was a medical procedure, and the next day we did the same. And the next day we did the same. And have done every single day since 1973. Now, where are the billions of dollars in the moral outrage for the lives of the innocent children who are lost every single day? It's not there. Why? Well, I think some of it is because we've adopted an evolutionary atheistic mindset that, okay, this is not really killing a person. Now let me ask you this question. Where do you get the idea that people are valuable? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among those rights are the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If you do not have a Creator who put His image, stamped it on humanity, then what do you have? Well, what you're going to see is, according to the atheistic proposition, what you then have is just the next animal in the line. And so you would be sitting maybe on a pew right here, and this would be the person that's a human, but right next to the human would be a chimpanzee, and right next to the chimpanzee would be a lemur, and right next to the lemur would be a monkey, and right next to the monkey would be a squirrel, and right next to the squirrel would be and you're just one on the chain. And so the idea that human life is valuable only comes from the idea that there's a Creator in whose image we have been molded. If you get rid of the Creator, you get rid of the foundation for inherent values of human life. Now, I'm not asking you to take my word for any of this. In fact, I'm going to show you all of this in a very logical progression. You're going to see it for yourself. But what I want you to see is that if atheism is true, then this idea of killing innocent children, well, they explain to us, well, there's nothing wrong with this from an atheistic standpoint. And they're right. From an atheistic standpoint, there's not anything wrong with it. But they're wrong. That there's not something wrong with it. Because atheism has never been right, and there is a God, and humans are in His image, and we as a nation are going to have to stand in judgment for what we have done on a scale that dwarfs what the Nazis did, that dwarfs what the late Canaanites who were sacrificing their children to Molech and burning them on a Molech statue. Okay, yeah, that was horrible, that was terrible. Maybe a few thousand a year. We're killing 2,400 a day. Continue with me, listen to this statement. Charles Darwin says, well, there's no fundamental difference between man and the higher mammals in their mental faculties. He says, Barbara Burke rather says, you know, among some animal species, infant killing appears to be a natural practice. Could it be natural for humans too, a trait inherited from our primate ancestors? Charles Darwin noted in The Sin of Man that infanticide has been probably the most important of all checks on population growth. My dad and brother used to do a lot of coon hunting. They bought a coon dog. The name was Queen, and very expensive. Coon dog was great. Well, it depends on what you think of a coon dog. You know, if you've done much coon hunting, some people are lazy coon hunters and some people are very aggressive coon hunters. This dog was not for a lazy coon hunter. This dog was one that if she didn't find a coon in a mile, she went 2. And if she didn't find a raccoon in 2 miles, she went 3. And if she didn't find one in 3 miles, she went 4 until she found one. And she was going to find one. And so they had to get a GPS. And she was very, her pedigree was awesome. She had 12 puppies, and they were going to go for about $1,000 a piece. And they thought, oh, this is great. She ate 11 of them. We did not send her to jail for that. We did not try her for infanticide. We did not send her to any type of criminal proceedings because she's an animal. You understand it? What is Barbara Burke saying? You know, if there's no God and we're just animals, well then when animals kill their babies, then that's all we're doing. So what's morally wrong with that? You see the problem. There's something very different between a dog killing her puppies and a human killing her baby. And the difference is, one of those living beings has been created in the image and likeness of God, and it doesn't matter how fast that baby will ever run. It doesn't matter how intelligent that baby ever is. It doesn't matter if that baby will be a burden on society from the second that baby is born. That baby has inherent value because that baby is born with the image of God stamped on him or her from conception. But according to atheism, now this guy, Richard Dawkins said of this guy that he's the leading atheistic ethicist, the person who's supposed to be able to tell you what's right and wrong, said he was the most moral individual that Richard Dawkins knew. Richard Dawkins, the highest, probably most well-known atheist in the world. He said, Peter Singer's the most moral guy I know. Okay? Most famous atheistic ethicist in the world at the present. Here's what he says. You know, if we compare a severely defective human infant with a non-human animal, a dog or pig, for example, we'll often find the non-human to have superior capacities. Now, notice this statement. Only the fact that the defective infant is a member of the species Homo sapiens leads it to be treated differently from the dog or pig. Species membership alone, however, is not morally relevant. He says, let's say we look at a child in utero, and that child's going to have developmental issues. Maybe some brain damage that's going to cause that child not to be able to function like we would hope that it would. And then we look at, let's say, a German Shepherd dog that is going to have some puppies that are going to be very good canine unit police type dogs. He said, but if we have said we've only got resources to keep one of these alive, we've always picked the human. For what reason? Well, because they're a member of the species of human. He said, but species membership's not morally relevant from an atheistic perspective. You see where he's going with that? You know, why have we said keep the human and get rid of the German Shepherd if the German Shepherd's going to be more beneficial to us? Notice what he says. If we can put aside the obsolete and erroneous notion of the sanctity of human life, we might start to look at human life as it really is. And what is that? Nevertheless, the main point is clear. Killing a disabled infant is not morally equivalent to killing a person. Very often, it's not wrong at all. Okay, listen to me. What you're told is that atheism and unbelief is just it's just an innocent academic belief that, hey, when people become atheists, it's not like they turn into moral monsters. It's not like they become just totally immoral, terrible people, that atheism is just an idea that they don't believe in God. Okay, no. That's not true. Psalm 14:1 explains, the fool said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They have done abominable things. There is none who does good, no, not one. If you put the idea that there is no God, no heaven, no hell, no soul, no spirit, no future into a person, and then say, figure out how to live right, it can't be done. And so, according to Darwin, you just follow the instincts and impulses that seem right to you. And then the sanctity of all human life goes out the window. And you start comparing whether a German Shepherd is going to be as valuable to society as a disabled infant. And then you start making decisions about, well, what was interesting about Peter Singer was, before we read this, let me explain to you what Peter Singer said. Peter Singer basically then said, hey, we've always said that you could, and when I say we, his atheistic society, his atheistic community has always said that you could abort a child that was going to be defective in their minds before the child was born. He said, but we've said that once they're born, you can't do that. Because he said birth doesn't mark a morally dividing line in his mind. He said, okay, we've always said before they're born, you could replace them, but after they're born, you couldn't. He said, but I've never understood that. Why would anybody say being born changes the status of what a person is? And at that point, you're like, okay, yeah, all right. So that's what we've always said as Christians. Just because one day before you weren't born, one day later you are. Okay, now what? You think he's going in the right direction. And then he says this. So I think if a child gets born and we find that they're defective in some way that we don't like as a society, you give them 1 month, 2 months, 3 months. In consultation with their doctors, the parents could just say, 3 months after that child is born, we'd like to eliminate this child now. That's the logical conclusion of, hey, if you could abort them 2 months before they're born, why not kill them 2 months after? And this is supposed to be the leading atheistic ethicist who Richard Dawkins says is the most moral person he knows. James Rachels, if I understood it, taught at a professor at the University of Alabama. In his book, notice if you can read that, Created from Animals, The Moral Implications of Darwinism. Here's what he says. An infant with severe brain damage, even if it survives for many years, may never learn to speak. Its mental powers may never rise above a primitive level. In fact, its psychological capacities may be markedly inferior to those of a typical rhesus monkey. In that case, moral individualism would see no reason to prefer its life over the monkeys. Some unfortunate humans, because they've suffered brain damage, are not rational agents. What are we to say about them? The natural conclusion, according to the doctrine we're thinking about here, would be that their status is that of mere animals, and perhaps we should go on to conclude that they may be used as non-human animals, or used as laboratory subjects or as food. Okay, folks, this is a PhD professor on a major campus in the United States of America. Right now, if you don't know, 80% of all professors on state-sponsored universities are atheists and or agnostics. Most of them are hard-nosed atheists. Imagine your kid at 18 years old, sitting in a class, and the professor saying, humans sometimes are less valuable than animals, and you could use humans as lab rats or as food. Now, here's what I want you to see. This is not Kyle Butt telling you the moral implications of atheism. Who's telling you this stuff? They are. Now, you've never read it, because the media doesn't want you to know that the leading atheists recognize that if you get rid of God, that there's no real human value, that there's no inherent value to human life. The media does not want you to know that if you get rid of the idea of God, then morality goes out the window. They don't want you to see this. But God is not trying to force His existence on you and His rules and show you the truth because He wants His idea to be accepted and all these other ideas. Okay, He's there, and He has made humans in His image, and He wants you to know that, because that is the reason why you value humans. That's the reason why you do to others like you want done to you. That's the reason why you put others in front of you, and you look out not only for your own needs but also for the needs of others, and you let this mind be in you which was also in Christ Jesus. And you do nothing through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind you look out for the interest of others. That's why you do it, because guess what? Every single person, whether they're smarter than you, whether they run faster than you, whether they're better looking than you, guess what? They're all made in the image and likeness of God. And you've all got value. We've all got value, unless there's no God. And if there's no God, you don't have it. Now here's the thing. We all know you do. So which belief nails down that foundation of humans are inherently valuable? Well, the belief in God is the only one that does that. In 2006, in Texas, the Texas Scientist of the Year, he was a reptile scientist, a reptile researcher, and was frustrated that humans were taking over the habitat of many of the reptiles he liked to study. And so he stood up in an auditorium that was there to see him receive his award for the Texas Scientist of the Year. And when he stood up to receive this award, he went over to the person who was doing the filming and said to that person, "Don't film this. I don't think the greater world is ready for what I'm about to say." And the cameraman was frustrated because that was his job, but he did not film what Dr. Pianka actually said. And it was reported from a person who was a creationist later in the audience of the bulk and the intent of his speech. And here's what the intent of his speech was. He said, humans are the problem on the planet. And we need to eliminate 90% of them. And they asked him in the question and answer section of his discussion, how would you do that? And he said, oh, we need something like an airborne Ebola virus that would kill people in about 3 days, but then would be, taken care of with, the germs would go out of the way soon after a week or so, and it wouldn't leave any lasting effects. And that's probably what we need, airborne Ebola. The man stands up and says, we need to kill 9 out of 10 people. He receives the Texas Scientist of the Year award, and there's an audience of 400 people. What do you do if you're in that audience? I'll tell you what they did. Stood up and gave him a standing ovation. If you think that our young people are not going to be affected by this, listen to this Facebook post of a student who was in the audience. Here's what he says. Dr. Pianka's talk at the TAS meeting was mostly of the problems humans are causing as we rapidly proliferate around the globe. He's a radical thinker, that one. I mean, he's basically advocating for the death of all but 10% of the current population, and at the risk of sounding just as radical, I think he's right. That's all glib to write on Facebook. This guy just said humans are the problem. He was a student listening to Dr. Pianka, and he said, I think the guy's right. We need to kill 9 out of 10 people. Do you wonder why we have school shootings? Do you wonder why many people no longer value others and inherently think that their lives are worth saving and worth helping? Yet there's a simple question. If you treat young people and teach them that they are animals, what will they behave like? Animals. If you teach them that they are made in the image and likeness of God, and that there is a God with an eternal nature that never changes, and the central aspect of that God's nature is love, and you were made in that God's image with the central aspect of your nature being love, will they behave differently? Yes, they will. That's why we teach about the nature of God. That's why we teach about inherent human value. Continue with me. You guys probably remember Dahmer. When the events occurred around what had happened with him, they shocked all of us. He was convicted of killing 17 young men and boys and doing terrible things in a serial killer way. I don't know if you ever saw the 1995 Stone Phillips interview with Jeffrey Dahmer and his dad Lionel Dahmer. It's fascinating. Jeffrey Dahmer was associated with the Lord's Church, and his dad was growing up. His dad and Jeffrey's mom were going through a divorce, and so at that time they were having serious family troubles, and they weren't connected to a congregation like his dad says they should have been. And at the time he wasn't educating Jeffrey in good Christian teachings, and because of that he admits, okay, Jeffrey got off. But in the course of this discussion with Stone Phillips in 1995, Stone Phillips asked Jeffrey Dahmer, he says, okay, you killed 19 people. Why did you do that? What made you think that that would ever be the right thing to do? And here's what Jeffrey Dahmer said. If a person doesn't think that there is a God to be accountable to, then what's the point of trying to modify your behavior to keep it within acceptable ranges? He says, that's how I thought anyway. And so then Stone Phillips asked him, at what point did you change your mind? Now listen to me. This is why I do what I do, a lot of it. He turns to his dad, Lionel, and he says, Dad, it was when you sent me the creation science material. He said, when I realized evolution was not true and that we are created, it made me stop and realize I had done something terrible. The point at which he realized there's a God in heaven who created him in his image is the point at which he realized, I've done something terrible. Now, the Dahmer story is very exciting. He starts getting some World Bible School lessons that come into the jail. He does them faithfully, decides he wants to become a Christian. There's a book called The Dark Journey, Deep Grace by the preacher from the Lord's Church who baptized him into Christ. It's a thrilling, thrilling story. But here's what's so interesting to me. When I got to Apologetics Press in 2000, there were in our files a manuscript that had the name Lionel Dahmer on the top of it. And I asked the director at the time, I said, what is this? I said, is he related to Jeffrey Dahmer? At the time, I didn't know. And he said, oh yeah, that was Jeffrey's dad. And if I understand it correctly, some of and much of the creation material that Lionel Dahmer gave to his son was from Apologetics Press. Now think about this. The singular idea that if there is a God, that means I'm important and other people are too. If there's not, you get the idea I'm not important and other people aren't either. Folks, what are the fruits of believing in God? Immediately, you have a structure by which you can say, do to others what you want them to do to you. Without a belief in God, there's no foundation for that. Sure appreciate your kind time and attention this morning. Glad that you were here. It's Friends and Family Day, I think, and I've heard that we've got some good food waiting on us after the sermon and the worship service, and that's exciting, and I hope that you'll all stay for that and really have enjoyed getting to be a part of your congregation this weekend.